This week, Nico, as always, is trying to drag me out of bed early in the morning to go for his walk, our early morning walk. One morning there, I got myself up. I was still a bit tired and dazed, and it was cold. And anyway, I dragged myself out of bed, got dressed, got his harness and lead, threw a hat on, and off we went. Got around the corner and were waving to a couple of people, other dog walkers, and suddenly realised for the second time that week that I'd forgotten something important. I didn't have a mask. And in our LGA, if you go off your property, you've got to have a mask on. So we rushed home, got a mask, and set out again, pondering this COVID-19 and what it's all about and what it means and the struggle that it is for many people. In Australia, there's increasing numbers, but the numbers are still, I guess, relatively low compared to most of the world. But it's still a worry. There's people who are sick and experiencing the severity of symptoms of COVID-19, but there's also those who are dying. The numbers compared to other nations are low, but it's difficult and painful for families and friends of those who are sick and dying. For us, I guess, there's the mental, psychological stress, anxiety, the economic realities. There's a story the other day on radio. A woman called in, and just they're trying to hear stories of what's the economic problems that people are experiencing out of COVID-19. And she said that her and her husband own a small business. They managed to get through last year with government support, JobKeeper and so on. But this year's much harder. The requirements are more difficult. It's harder to access funds. It's just not easy. And they don't know whether they'll make it. And there's nothing they can do. That's the problem. They feel helpless and hopeless because they can't do anything to change the situation. There is no work, there's no opportunity of work, there's no way they can work harder or more effective, put other provisions in place in their business. All they can do is sit back and wait and watch the bills mount up. That's having a psychological stress on them and their lives. This week, Lifeline Australia reported a record day in terms of number of phone calls that they've received. People anxious, afraid, uncertain, confused. People isolated and alone and needing to talk. Not being able to get out of their homes or just to exercise, but not being able to talk to people, meet with people, share the problems. And I guess this couple, their difficulties are exacerbated by the fact that they can't meet with friends and family and share the pain and the load and the struggles and the difficulties. It's just them. In our world, there's a lot of challenges and struggles. There's a lot of pain and hardship. There are people who are hungry every day for food. There are people who are hurting, traumatised, experiencing violence. There are people who are homeless, kids on the street in some places, older people, refugees who are kicked out of their homes by oppressive regimes or war or whatever it is. And they're lost, nowhere to go. In the midst of all this, I've been pondering the words of John's story of Jesus in chapter 6, this long chapter we've been looking at, where he says Jesus speaks of being the bread of life. Anyone who feeds on me will never hunger. The one who eats of me will never die. What does this mean? What does this mean in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of isolation, in the midst of fear, helplessness, hopelessness, in the midst of the living and the dying of our lives? What does it mean? It seems such a simplistic notion in some ways, but when I thought about it, this community that John was writing to, Christian community at the end of the first century, probably, I don't know, a small group of people in this large, powerful Roman Empire. The Christians were already experiencing persecution from Rome. It wasn't easy. They were isolated from their Jewish background, not allowed in the synagogues anymore. There was this isolation, and they were a minority that was persecuted. It was a hard world. People who were not necessarily well off, people who struggled to make ends meet, to stay alive, to feed their families. Life wasn't necessarily easy. There were struggles and questions. And John's writing the story of Jesus to say this way that Jesus proclaimed is another way in the world. And it's a way that's gripped us, that's grasped us, that we've been embraced into. It's a way of love, it's a way of justice, of hope, peace. When we look at the Roman Empire and the powers and principalities of our world, they don't hold up. The elites get more than they need, and the rest of us suffer. The way of Jesus was a way of belonging together, of holding things together, of being one and sharing what we have, of sharing our joys and our pains, sharing our hungers for meaning, for food, for life, and giving to one another what we have. It's about a community that when together we have enough and we can do it. We can make our way through this. And I think we're learning a bit of this in COVID-19 because we recognise in our isolation we need other people, we need each other. We can't do it alone. And we're forced to be alone, and it's hard. This week I made one of my very rare excursions outside the house, except to walk Nico in the mornings. I had to participate in a funeral. I was invited to participate in the funeral of a fellow I've known for over 25 years when I became the minister of the church he was part of. And the last few years he's been sick, and there's been illness and some dementia, and so I was asked as the minister who's probably known him in recent times the best to come and share some reflections. And as we sat, a small group under the COVID restrictions, the maximum we're allowed, in the church, and shared stories of Ray, his life, who he was, joys and sorrows, funny stories, sad stories, stories of life. We reflected on a fellow whose faith was strong and real. Neil, the minister in the church, talked about how Ray came into this church with his wife, Marion, and they worshipped there Sunday after Sunday. They sang hymns, they prayed, they heard the scriptures read, stories of Jesus, stories of faith. They heard these reflected on and thoughts about them. They prayed and they brought their prayers, their deep and desperate prayers, their joyful prayers. Families celebrated baptisms and weddings and other things. We heard these stories, and we heard how Ray came forward to receive communion, the Lord's Supper, this memorial feast, if you like, of Jesus' last meal, where he sits with his disciples and he breaks bread and gives it to them, and he takes a cup and he blesses it too and gives it to them and says, "This is my body which is broken for you, and this is my blood which is shed. Eat and drink this and remember me." And remembering me is, I guess, in a way, eating of him, of his way. It's remembering this way of Jesus, which is a way of justice and love and peace, inclusion, belonging. This way in the world, which is about life and hope. But it's about being together. And when we heard the stories of Ray, you know, his faith was not one of bold theological concepts, rationalising things, belief systems. It was about living it out. He heard what Jesus did and he went and did it in his way. Acts of kindness. When he took on work for other people, paid or voluntary, he always gave more than was expected. Not because he wanted thanks or to promote himself or anything else, but as an act of kindness, because he could. It was a gift he had to offer someone else. And he did many things for many people and touched many lives in simple and profound ways, with acts of love and care and gifts given in joy and peace. And I think that's what it means when Jesus says, "Eat of me the living bread, the bread of life, and you won't die." It's not just about physical death. Of course we'll die physically, but there's a spiritual life beyond this experience now. It's about, we won't die in our being, that the hunger within us of meaning, of purpose, of hope, of life will remain strong and grow within us as we eat and feed on his way, which is the way of God in the world, the way of love and justice and truth and hope and belonging together. And when we walk in this way together, the world is a better place. And others will benefit just as we will. So I wonder what it means for you and for me to eat of the bread of life now, in this day, in this COVID-19 world, and to trust in this God who holds us in love and grace and invites us into a deeper experience of life in him. Amen.